Hello, everyone. I'm here to go over a piece that I wrote about a month ago called What Can We Learn About Engineering and Innovation from Half a Century of the Game of Life Cellular Automaton? And is kind of the motivating um, picture to begin with. So, um, meta-engineering and laws of innovation. Things are invented, things are discovered, and somehow there's an arc of progress that's formed. But are there what amount to laws of innovation that govern that arc of progress? There are some exponential and other laws that purport to at least measure overall quantitative aspects of progress, number of transistors on a chip, numbers of papers published in a year, and so on. But what about all the disparate innovations that make up that arc of progress? Do we have a systematic way to study those? We can look at the plans for different kinds of bicycles or rockets or microprocessors, and over the course of years, we'll see the results of successive innovations. But most of the time, those innovations won't stay within one particular domain, say shapes of bicycle frames. Rather, they'll keep on pulling in innovations from other domains, say new materials or new manufacturing techniques. But if we want to get closer to the study of the pure phenomenon of innovation, we need a case where, preferably over a long period of time, everything that happens can be described in a uniform way within a single narrowly defined framework. Well, some time ago, I realized that actually, yes, there is such a case. And I've even personally been following it for about half a century. It's the effort to build engineering structures within the game of life cellular automaton. They might serve as clocks or wires or logic gates or things that generate digits of pi, but the point is that they're all just patterns of bits. So when we talk about innovation in this case, we're talking about the rather pure question of how patterns of bits get invented or discovered. Well, as a long-time serious researcher of the science of cellular automata and of what they generically do, I must say I've long been frustrated by how specific, whimsical, and non-scientific the things people do with the game of life have often seemed to me to be. But what I now realize is that all that detail and all that hard work have now created what amounts to a unique data set of engineering innovation. And what I want to do here is to talk about what one can call meta-engineering and to study, in effect, what happened in that process of engineering over the nearly 6 decades since the game of life was invented. We'll see in rather pure form many phenomena that are at least anecdotally familiar from our overall experience of progress and innovation. Most of the time, the first step is to identify an objective, some purpose one can describe and wants to achieve. Much more rarely, one instead observes something that happens, then realizes there's a way one can meaningfully make use of it. But starting from an objective, one either takes components one has and puts human effort into arranging them to invent something that will achieve the objective, or in effect, usually at least somewhat systematically and automatically, one searches to try to discover new ways to achieve the objective. So as we explore what's been done with the game of life, we'll see occasional sudden advances, together with much larger amounts of incremental progress. We'll see towers of technology being built, and we'll see old, rather simple technology being used to achieve new objectives. But most of all, we'll see an interplay between what gets discovered by searching possibilities and what gets invented by explicit human effort. The principle of computational equivalence implies that there is, in a sense, infinite richness to what a computational system like the game of life can ultimately do. And it's the role of science to explore this richness in all its breadth. But when it comes to engineering and technology, the crucial question is what we choose to make the system do and what paths we follow to get there. Inevitably, some of this is determined by the underlying computational structure of the system, but much of it is a reflection of how we as humans do things and the patterns of choices we make. And that's what we'll be able to study at quite large scale by looking at the nearly 6 decades of work on the game of life. How similar are the results of such purposeful engineering to the results of blind adaptive evolution of the kind that occurs in biology? So I recently explored adaptive evolution as it happens using cellular automata as a model and saw that it can routinely deliver what can be seen like what seem like sequences of new ideas. But now in the example of the game of life, we have what we can explicitly identify as sequences of new ideas. And so we're in a position to compare the results of human effort, aided in many cases by systematic search, with what we can automatically do by the algorithmic process of adaptive evolution. In the end, we can think of the set of things that we can in principle engineer as being laid out in a kind of meta-engineering space, much as we can think of mathematical theorems we can prove as being laid out in meta-mathematical space. In the mathematical case, notwithstanding some of my own work, the vast majority of theorems have historically been found purely by human effort. But as we'll see here, in game of life engineering, it's been a mixture of human effort and fairly automated exploration of meta-engineering space. Though, much like in traditional mathematics, we're still in a sense always only we're only pursuing objectives we've already conceptualized. And in this way, what we're doing is very different from what I've done for so long in studying the science, or as I would now say, the ruleology of what computational systems like cellular automata, of which the game of life is an example, do in the wild, when they're unconstrained by objectives we're trying to achieve for them. Okay, so let's start off talking about the nature of the game of life. So here's a typical example. Hopefully. Here's a, no. All right. Here's a typical example of what it looks like to run the game of life. There's a lot of complicated and kind of hard to understand stuff going on here, but there are still some recognizable structures like the blinkers that alternate and on successive steps and the gliders that steadily move across the screen. So we can see here, there's a blinker and there's a glider. So seeing these structures might make one think that one should be able to do engineering in the game of life, setting up patterns that can ultimately do all sorts of things. And indeed, our main subject is the actual development of such engineering over the past nearly 6 decades since the introduction of the game of life. What we'll be concentrating on is essentially the technology of the game of life, how we take, I got to stop this thing doing that, how we take the raw material that the game of life provides and make from it meaningful engineering structures. But what about the science of the game of life? What can we say about what the game of life naturally does, independent of useful structures we create in it? The vast majority of the efforts that's been put into the game of life over the past half century hasn't been about this. But this type of fundamental question is central to what one asks in what I now call ruleology, a new kind of science that I've been energetically pursuing since the early 1980s. Ruleology looks in general at classes of systems rather than at the kind of specifics that have typically been explored in the game of life. And within ruleology, the game of life is in a sense nothing special. It's just one of many class 4 2D cellular automata. In my numbering scheme, it's the 2-color 9-neighbor cellular automaton with outer totalistic code 224. Well, my own investigations of cellular automata have particularly focused in 1D rather than 2D examples. And I think that's been crucial to many of the scientific discoveries I've made, because somehow one learns so much more by being able to see at a glance the history of a system, rather than just seeing frames in a video go by. So with a class 4 2D rule like the game of life, one can begin to approach this by including kind of trails of what's previously happened. And let me just show you that. I'll often show this visualization here. So this is the thing that I showed a video of. This is now showing it with kind of historical trails in each of these frames. So we can get a more complete view of history by looking at the whole 2+1 dimensional space-time history, though then we're kind of confronted with 3D forms that are somewhat difficult for our human visual system to parse. So those little stripes going off, those are the gliders propagating through space over time. But taking a slice through this 3D form, we get these sort of silhouette pictures that turn out to look remarkably similar to what I generated in large quantities starting in the early 1980s across many one-dimensional cellular automata. So such pictures with their complicated forms highlight the computational irreducibility that's close at hand, even in the game of life. And indeed, it's the presence of such computational irreducibility that ultimately makes possible the richness of engineering that can be done in the game of life. But in actually doing that engineering and in setting up structures and processes that behave in understandable and technologically useful ways, we need to keep the computational irreducibility bottled up. And in the end, we can think of the path of engineering innovation in the game of life as like an effort to navigate through an ocean of computational irreducibility, finding islands of reducibility that achieve the purposes we want. Okay, so let's talk about what's been made in the game of life. So most of the structures of engineering interest in the game of life are somehow persistent. The simplest are structures that just remain constant. So some small examples of those are these. And yes, structures in the game of life have been given all sorts of usually whimsical names, which I will use here. And in that vein, structures in the game of life that remain constant are normally called still lifes. So beyond structures that just remain constant, there are oscillators that produce periodic patterns. We'll talk about oscillators at much greater length in a little while, but here are a few examples where, and we can also kind of do a visualization where we're showing trails. So next in our inventory of classes of structures come gliders, or in general, spaceships. I told you these were whimsical names. Structures that repeat periodically but move when they do so. So a classic example is the basic glider that I just showed a couple of moments ago, which takes on the same form every 4 steps after moving one cell horizontally and one cell vertically. So that's what that does. And here are a few small examples of other spaceship structures. And still lifes, oscillators, and spaceships are most of what one sees in the ash that survives from typical random initial conditions. And for example, the end result after 1103 steps from the evolution that we looked at before consists of this inventory of objects. So all the structures that we've seen so far were found not long after the game of life was invented. Indeed, pretty much as soon as it was simulated on a computer. But one feature that they all share is that they don't systematically grow. They always return to the same number of black cells. And so one of the early surprises in 1970 was the discovery of a glider gun that shoots out a glider every 30 steps forever. And here it is doing its thing. And we can see that's different versions that show the full history of the glider gun. So something that gives a sense of progress that's been made in game of life technology is that a more efficient glider gun, remember this one is a period 30 that I'm showing so far, a more efficient glider gun with period 15 was discovered, but only in 2024, 54 years after the previous one. And here is that more efficient glider gun. So another kind of structure that was quickly discovered in the early history of the game of life is a puffer, a spaceship that leaves debris behind, in this case, every 128 steps. But given these kinds of components, what can one build? Something constructed very early was the breeder that uses streams of gliders to create glider guns that themselves then generate streams of gliders. That's kind of an instantaneous view with trails. And this is kind of the 3-dimensional structure showing glider guns being produced, which then produce more gliders. So the original pattern I'm showing covers about 250,000 cells, a region of about 250,000 cells, with about 4,060 of them being black. So running it for 1,000 steps, we see the following kind of structure. We're building up. Oh, that's again looking at a slice of the previous object. But then if we build up this if we let it run for 1,000 steps, as a breeder running for 1,000 steps, we see that it builds up a triangle with a quadratically increasing number of gliders. Okay, so that shows that in principle, it's possible to fill a growing region of space because we're going to have just more and more and more gliders generated here. But is there a more efficient way to do that, to make a thing that fills space? The surprisingly simple answer, discovered in 1993, is yes. Here it is. So what other things? So just to explain, this pattern that we see here will just progressively grow bigger and bigger and make that diamond shape with black cells going across the diamond shape, and it will get bigger and bigger. So what other kinds of things can be built in the game of life? Lots of things, even from the simple structures we've seen so far. So, for example, here's a structure. Oh, that's the space filler again, showing it in 3D. But here's another structure that can be built. This is a structure that computes the primes. So you see down there that the positions at which these structures occur correspond to the values of primes. It basically emits a lightweight spaceship at step 100 plus 120 n, only if n is prime. So it's a little more obvious how this thing works if we kind of view it in space-time. In effect, it's on the right, it's kind of running a sieve of Eratosthenes, in which all multiples of all numbers are instantiated as streams of gliders, which knock out spaceships that are generated at non-prime positions, leaving only the spaceships that show up at prime positions. So if we look at the original pattern here, it's actually made up of a collection of rather simple structures. There's an inventory of different, how many of each of these structures we have. And indeed, these particular structures have been used to build all sorts of things, including, for example, Turing machine emulators, also an emulator for the game of life itself. So this is a 499 by 499 cell pattern corresponding to a single emulated cell in the game of life. So both these last two patterns were constructed in the 1990s from components that have been known since the early 1970s. And as we can see, they're large and complicated. But do they need to be so large? One of the lessons of the principle of computational equivalence is that in the computational universe, there's almost always a way to do just as much, but with much less. And indeed, in the game of life, many, many discoveries along these lines have been made in the past few decades. As we'll see often, but not always, these discoveries built on new devices and new mechanisms that were identified in the intervening years. A long series of such devices and mechanisms involved handling signals associated with streams of gliders. For example, the glider pusher from 1993 has the somewhat subtle but useful effect of pushing a glider by one cell when it goes past. And you can kind of see that particularly clearly in this 3D rendering here. Another example, actually already known in 1971 and based on the period 15 pentadecathlon oscillator, is a glider reflector. There you can see the glider being reflected here in the 3D rendering. But a feature of this glider pusher and glider reflector is they work only when both the glider and the stationary object that's doing the pushing or reflection are in a particular phase with respect to their periods. And this makes it very tricky to build larger structures out of these that operate correctly, and in many cases wouldn't be possible but for the commensurability of the period 30 of the original glider gun and the period 15 of the glider reflector. So could glider pushing and glider reflection have been done more robustly? The answer turns out to be yes, though it wasn't until 2020 that the Bandersnatch was created, a completely static structure that pushes gliders independent of their phase. Meanwhile, in 2013, the Snark had been created, which served as a phase-independent glider reflector. One theme, to which we'll return later, is that after certain functionality was first built in the game of life, there followed many optimizations, achieving that functionality more robustly, with smaller patterns and so on. An important methodology has revolved around so-called hasslers, which in effect allow one to mine small pieces of computational irreducibility by providing harnesses that rein in behavior, typically returning patterns to their original states after they've done what one wants them to do. So, for example, here's a hassler found, as it happens, just on February 8th, 2025, right when I was working on this piece, that harnesses the first pattern that we looked at above, that didn't stabilize for 1103 steps, into an oscillator with period 80. And based on this, indeed later that same day, in February of this year, the most compact ever spaceship gun was constructed from this. So things happening, even after I wrote the piece that I wrote a little bit ago, more discoveries have been made that sort of fill in footnotes to that piece. So let's talk about the overall arc of progress. So we've talked about some of what it's been possible to build in the game of life over the years. Now what I want to talk about is how that happened, or in other words, the arc of progress in the game of life. And as a first indication of this, we can plot the number of new life structures that have been identified each year, or more specifically, the number of structures deemed significant enough to name and to record in the LifeWiki database or its predecessors. So there is an immediate impression of several waves of activity. And we can break this down into activity around various common categories of structures. For oscillators, we can see sort of fairly continuous activity for 5 decades, but with rapid acceleration recently. For spaceships and guns, we see a long dry spell from the early 1970s to the 1990s, followed by fairly consistent activity since. And for conduits and reflectors, we see almost nothing until sudden peaks of activity in the mid-1990s and mid-2010s, respectively. But what was actually done to find all these structures? There have basically been 2 methods, construction and search. Construction is a story of explicit engineering and of using human thought to build up what one wants. Search, on the other hand, is a story of automation and of taking algorithmically generated, usually large collections of possible patterns, and testing them to find ones that do what one wants. Particularly in more recent times, it's also become common to interleave these methods, for example, using construction to build a framework and then using search to find specific patterns that implement some feature of that framework. When one uses construction, it's like inventing a structure. When one uses search, it's like discovering it. So how much of each is being done in practice? Well, if we just text mine descriptions of recently recorded structures, the result is this, suggesting that at least in recent times, search, i.e. discovery, has become the dominant methodology for finding new structures. When the game of life was being invented, it wasn't long before it was being run on computers, and people were trying to classify things it could do. Still lifes and simple oscillators showed up immediately, and then evolving from the so-called R pentomino, which was the initial condition we looked at the beginning here. After 69 steps, something unexpected showed up. In between complicated behavior that was hard to describe was a single freestanding structure that just moved systematically, a glider. Some other moving structures dubbed spaceships were also observed, but the question arose, could there be a structure that would somehow systematically grow forever? To find it involved a mixture of discovery and invention. In running from the R pentomino initial condition, lots of things happen. But at step 785, it was noticed that there appeared the following structure. For a while, this structure, dubbed the queen bee, behaves in a fairly orderly way, producing two stable beehive structures visible here as kind of vertical columns. But then it decays into more complicated behavior. Yeah, I guess we can see the vertical columns here of the beehive structures. And then we see this decaying into more complicated behavior. But could this discovered behavior be stabilized? The answer was that yes, if a queen bee was combined with two blocks, it would just repeatedly shuttle back and forth. Here it is doing that. What about two queen bees? Now, whenever these collided, there was a side effect. A glider was generated, with the result that the whole structure became a glider gun, repeatedly producing gliders forever. There's the original period 30 glider gun. The glider gun was the first major example of a structure in the game of life that was found, at least in part, by construction. And within a year of it being found in November 1970, two more guns with very similar methods of operation had been found. Here they are. But then the well ran dry, and no further gun was found until 1990. Pretty much the same thing happened with spaceships. Four were found in 1970, but no more were found until 1989. And as we'll talk about later, it was in a sense a quintessential story of computational irreducibility. There was no way to predict or construct what spaceships would exist. One just had to do the computation, i.e. search, to find out. It was, however, easier to have incremental success with oscillators. And as we'll see, pretty much every year an oscillator with some new period was found, essentially always by search. Some periods were kind of long holdouts. For example, the first period 19 oscillator was found only in 2023, once again reflecting the effects of computational irreducibility. Glider guns provided a source of signals for life engineering. But what could one do with these signals? An important idea that first showed up in the Breeder in 1971 was glider synthesis, the concept that combinations of gliders could produce other structures. So, for example, it was found that three carefully arranged gliders could generate a period 15 pentadecathlon oscillator, and here you see that happening. It was also soon found that 8 gliders could make the original glider gun. The Breeder made glider guns by a slightly more ornate method. And eventually they developed the conjecture that any structure could be synthesized from gliders would need at most 15 gliders carefully arranged at positions whose values effectively encoded the object to be constructed. By the end of the 1970s, a group of committed life enthusiasts remained, but there was something of a feeling that the low-hanging fruit had been picked, and it wasn't clear where to go next. But after a somewhat slow decade, work on the game of life picked up substantially towards the end of the 1980s. Perhaps my own work on cellular automata, and particularly the identification of class 4 cellular automata, of which the game of life is a 2D example, had something to do with it. And no doubt it also helped that the fairly widespread availability of faster kind of workstation class computers now made it possible for many people to do large-scale systematic searches. In addition, when the web arrived in the early 1990s, it let people much more readily share results and had the effect of greatly expanding and organizing the community of life enthusiasts. In the 1990s, along with more powerful searches that found new spaceships and guns, there was a burst of activity in constructing elaborate machines out of existing known structures. The idea was to start from a known type of machine, say a Turing machine, then to construct a life implementation of it. The constructions were made particularly ornate by the need to make the phases of gliders, guns, and so on appropriately correspond. Needless to say, any life configuration can be thought of as doing some computation, but the machines that were constructed were ones whose purpose and functionality was already well established in general computation, independent of the game of life. Well, if the 1990s saw a push towards construction in game of life, the first decade of the 2000s saw a great expansion of search. Increasingly powerful cloud and distributed computing allowed censuses to be created of structures emerging from billions, then trillions of initial conditions. Mostly what was emphasized was finding new instances of existing categories of objects, like oscillators and spaceships. There were particular challenges, like, as we'll talk about later, finding oscillators of any period, finally solved in 2023, or finding spaceships with different patterns of motion. Searches did yield what in censuses were usually called objects with unusual growth, but mostly these were not viewed as being of engineering utility and so were not extensively studied, even though from the point of view of the science of the game of life, they are, for example, perhaps the most revealing examples of computational irreducibility. Well, as had happened throughout the history of the game of life, some of the most notable new structures were created, sometimes over a long period of time, by a mixture of construction and search. For example, the stably reflect gliders without regard to phase, SNARC, finally obtained in 2013, was the result of using parts of the sort of ultimately unstable simple structures construction from around 1998 and combining them with a hard to explain why it works, still life found by search. Well, another example was the Sir Robin Knight ship, K-Knight, Knight ship, a spaceship that moves like a chess knight, 2 cells down and 1 across. So in 2017, a spaceship search found a structure that in 6 steps has many elements that make a knight move, but then subsequently falls apart. But the next year, a carefully orchestrated search was able to find a tail that adds a fix to this and successfully produces a perfect knight ship. By the way, the idea that one can take something that almost works and find a way to fix it is one that's appeared repeatedly in the engineering history of the game of life. At the outset, it's far from obvious that such a strategy would be viable, but the fact that it seems to be similar to the story of why both biological evolution and machine learning are viable, which, as I talked about actually recently, can be viewed as yet another consequence of the phenomenon of computational irreducibility. One thing that's happened many times in the history of the game of life is that at some point, some category of structure, like a conduit, is identified and named, but then it's realized that actually there was something that could be seen as an instance of the same category of structure found much earlier, though without the clarity of the later instance. Its significance wasn't recognized. For example, in 1995, the Herschel conduit that moves a particular sort of H-like structure from one position, it's an H-like structure that looks like the Herschel symbol for Uranus, to another. So here's an example, and there's a little H over there, being moved here. It moves that structure from one position to another, and here in 64 steps, was discovered by a search. But then it was realized that if looked at correctly, a similar phenomenon had actually already been seen in 1972 in the form of a structure that effectively takes a slightly different pattern and moves it in 28 steps to another structure at a different position, albeit with a certain amount of containable other activity. So looking at what we saw earlier, the plots of the number of new structures found per year, we see the largest peak after 2020. And yes, it seems that during the pandemic, people spent more time on the game of life. in particular trying to fill in tables of structures of particular types, for example, with each possible period. But what about the human side of engineering in the game of life? The activity brought in many people from many different backgrounds, and particularly in earlier years, they often operated quite independently and with very different methods, some not even using a computer. But if we look at all recorded structures, we can look at how many structures in total different people contributed and when they made these contributions. Well, needless to say, given that we're dealing with an almost 60-year span, different people tend to show up as active in different periods. We can see their activity of different named people here on the right-hand side. Looking at everyone, there's a roughly exponential distribution. This is on a log scale here of the number of named structures they contributed. Though actually, note that several of the top contributors, many of whom I've met, one of whom I actually saw just a few days ago. Many of the top contributors found parameterized collections of structures and then recorded many instances of those. All right, let's talk about the example of oscillators. So as a first systematic innovation history in the game of life, we'll talk about oscillators. Here are the periods of oscillators that were found up to 1980. So as of 1980, many periods were missing. But in fact, all periods are possible, though it wasn't until 2023 that they were all filled in. And here we see them just up to period 30, all the different objects, oscillators, and when they were discovered. Well, if we plot the number of distinct periods, say below 60, found in a given year, we can get kind of a first sense of the arc of progress in oscillator technology in the game of life. Finding an oscillator of a given period is one thing, but how about the smallest oscillator of that period? We can be fairly certain that not all of these are known, even for periods below 30. But here's a plot that shows when the progressive, sort of smallest so far oscillators were found for a given period. So red indicates the first instance of a given period, blue the best result, the time when the best result to date was found. So here's the corresponding plot for all periods up to 100. But what about the actual reduction in size that's been achieved? So here's a plot for each oscillator period showing the sequence of sizes found. In effect, the arc of engineering optimization that's achieved for that period. And here's a 3D version of the same thing. So what are the actual patterns associated with these various oscillators? So here are some results, including the kind of those dots at the bottom show kind of the timelines of when the patterns were found. But how were these all found? So as I mentioned before, the period 2 blinker was very obvious, showing up in evolution from almost any random initial condition. Some other oscillators were also easily found by looking at the evolution of particular simple initial conditions. For example, a line of 10 black cells after 3 steps gives the period 15 pentadecathlon. Similarly, the period 3 pulsar appears after from a pair of length 5 blocks after 22 steps. So many early oscillators were found by sort of iterative experimentation, often starting with stable still life configurations, then perturbing them slightly, as in this period 4 case. Another common strategy for finding oscillators, we'll talk about more later, is to take an unstable configuration, then stabilize it by putting robust still lifes, such as a block for cells or an eater around them. So that gives results like these. You can see the blocks and eaters, the blocks, there are eaters around these particular structures. So for periods that can be formed as LCMs of smaller periods, one sort of construction-oriented strategy has been to take oscillators with appropriate smaller periods and combine them, as in these cases. So they're period 4 and period 3 combined into a period 12 and so on. So in general, many different strategies have been used, as we can see in this sequence of period 3 oscillators recorded over the years, where the smallest so far instances have are highlighted with red borders. So that there's really quite a diversity of different methods, different solutions to the problem of making a period 3 object. So by the mid-1990s, oscillators with many periods have been found, but there were still holdouts, like period 19. And for example, pretty much all periods between 61 and 70, except as it happened, 66. So at the time, all sorts of complicated constructions, say of prime generators, were nevertheless being done. And in 1996, it was figured out that one can, in effect, always build a machine using only structures that had already been found 2 decades earlier that would serve as an oscillator of any sufficiently large period. So here, 67, effectively by sending a signal around a loop of an appropriate size. But by the 2010s, with large numbers of fast computers becoming available, there was again an emphasis on pure random search. So a handful of highly efficient programs were developed that could be run on anyone's machine. And in a typical case, the search might consist of starting, say, from a trillion randomly chosen initial conditions, or from a trillion randomly or kind of soups, and then identifying new structures that emerge, then seeing whether these act, for example, as oscillators. Typically, any new discovery was immediately reported in online forums, leading to variations of it being tried, and new follow-up results often being reported within hours or days. Many of the random searches started from just 16 by 16 regions of randomly chosen cells, or larger regions with symmetries imposed. And in a typical manifestation of computational irreducibility, many surprisingly small and random looking, at least up to symmetries, results were found. So for example, here's the sequence of recorded period 16 oscillators with the smaller than before cases highlighted again. Up through the 1990s, results were typically found by a mixture of construction and small-scale search. But in 2016, results from large-scale random searches, sometimes symmetrical, sometimes not, started to appear. The contrast between construction and search could be dramatic. Like here's the example for period 57. One might wonder whether there could actually be a systematic, purely algorithmic way to find, say, possible oscillators of a given period. And indeed, for one-dimensional cellular automata, as I noted in 1984, it turns out that there is. Say one considers blocks of cells of width W. Which block can follow which other is determined by a de Bruijn graph, or equivalently a finite state machine. If one's going to have a pattern with period P, all blocks that appear in it must also be periodic with period P. But such blocks just form a subgraph of the overall de Bruijn graph, or equivalently form another, smaller finite state machine, and then all patterns with period P must correspond to paths through the subgraph. But how long are the blocks one has to consider? In 1D cellular automata, it turns out there's an upper bound of 2 to the 2p. But for 2D cellular automata, like the game of life, there is in general no such upper bound, a fact related to the undecidability of the 2D tiling problem. And the result is that there's no complete systematic algorithm to find oscillators in a general 2D cellular automaton, or presumably in the game of life. But as was already realized in the mid-1990s, it's still possible to use algorithmic methods to fill in pieces of patterns. The idea is to define part of a pattern of a given period, then use this as a constraint on filling in the rest of it, finding solutions that satisfy the constraint using SAT-solving techniques. In practice, this approach has more often been used for spaceships than for oscillators, not least because it's only practical for small periods. But one feature of it is that it can generate fairly large patterns with a given period. Yet another method that's been tried has been to generate oscillators by colliding gliders in many possible ways. But while this is definitely useful if one's interested in what can be made using gliders, it doesn't seem to have, for example, allowed people to find much in the way of interesting new oscillators. All right, let's talk about modularity. In traditional engineering, a key strategy is modularity. Rather than trying to build something all in one go, the idea is to build a collection of independent subsystems from which the whole system can then be assembled. But how does this work in the game of life? We might imagine that to identify the modular parts of a system, we'd have to know the process by which the system was put together and the intent involved. But because in the game of life, we're ultimately just dealing with pure patterns of bits, we can in effect just come in at the end and algorithmically figure out what pieces are operating as separate modular parts. So how can we do this? Basically, what we want to find out is which parts of a pattern operate independently at a given step, in the sense that those parts don't have any overlap in the cells they affect. Given in the rules for the game of life, a particular cell can affect only the 9 cells in its 3x3 neighborhood, we can say that the black cells only have overlapping effects if they're at most 2√2 cell units apart. So then we can draw a nearest neighbor graph that shows which cells are connected in this sense. But what about the whole evolution? Well, we can draw what amounts to a causal graph that shows the causal connections between the independent modular parts that exist at each step. And given this, we can summarize kind of the modular structure of this particular oscillator by the pure structure of its causal graph. Ultimately, all that matters in the overall operation of the oscillator is the partial ordering defined by this graph. Parts that appear sort of horizontally separated, or more precisely in anti-chains, or in physics terminology, space-like separated, can be generated independently and in parallel. But parts that follow each other in the partial order need to be generated in that order, i.e. in physics terms, they're time-like separated. So as another example, let's look at graphs for various oscillators at period 16, here they are, that we looked at before. What we see is that the early period 16 oscillators were quite modular and had parts that in effect operated independently. But the later, smaller ones were not so modular. And indeed, the last one shown here from 2020 had no parts that could operate independently. The whole pattern had to be taken together at each step. And indeed, what we'll often see is that the more optimized a structure is, the less modular it tends to be. If we're going to construct something by hand, we usually need to assemble it in parts because that's what allows us to understand what we're doing. But if, for example, we just find a structure in a search, there's no reason for it to be understandable, and there's no reason for it to be particularly modular. So different steps in a given oscillator can involve different numbers of modular parts. But as a simple way to assess the modularity of an oscillator, we can just ask for the average number of parts over the course of one period. So for example, here are results for period 30 oscillators. So later on, we'll talk about how we can use the level of modularity to assess whether a pattern is likely to have been found by a search or by construction. But for now, this shows how the modularity index had varied over the years for the best known progressively smaller oscillators of this particular period, with the main conclusion being that as oscillators get more optimized for size, so also their modularity tends to decrease. So that's the modularity plotted for given sizes of oscillators as a function of time. All right, let's talk about gliders and spaceships. Oscillators are structures that cycle but don't move. Gliders and more generally spaceships are structures that move every time they cycle. So when the game of life was first introduced, 4 examples of these, all of period 4, were found almost immediately. The last one being the result of trying to extend the results before it. Here are the 4 period 4 structures, glider structures, and spaceship structures. So within a couple of years, experimentation had revealed 2 variants with periods 12 and 20 respectively, involving additional structures. But after that, for nearly 2 decades, no more spaceships were found. In 1989, however, a systematic method for searching was invented, and in the years since, a steady stream of new spaceships have been found. So a variety of different periods have been seen, as well as a variety of speeds and 3 different angles. So the forms of these spaceships are quite diverse. Some are tightly integrated, while some others have many modular pieces, as revealed by their causal graphs. Period 96 spaceships provide an interesting example of the arc of progress in the game of life. Back in 1971, a systematic enumeration of small polyominoes was done, looking for one that could reproduce itself. While no polyomino on its own seemed to do this, a case was found where part of the pattern produced after 48 steps seemed to reappear every 48 steps thereafter. One might expect this repeated behavior to continue forever, but in a typical manifestation of computational irreducibility, it doesn't, instead stopping its regeneration after 24 cycles and then reaching a steady state apart from radiated gliders after 3,911 steps. But from an engineering point of view, this kind of complexity was just viewed as a nuisance, and efforts were made to kind of tame and avoid it. And adding just one still life block to the so-called switch engine produces a structure that keeps generating a periodic wake forever. There it is. But can this somehow be refactored as a pure spaceship that doesn't leave anything behind? In 1991, it was discovered that yes, there was an arrangement of 13 switch engines that could successfully clean up behind themselves to produce a structure that would act as a spaceship of period 96. But could this be made simpler? It took many years and tests of many different configurations. But in the end, it was found that just 2 switch engines were sufficient. Here's that arc of progress. So looking at the final pattern gives a definite impression of sort of narrowly contained complexity. What about causal graphs? Basically, these just decrease in width, i.e. number of independent modular parts, as the number of engines decreases. Like many other things in game of life engineering, both search and construction have been used to find spaceships. As an extreme example of construction, let's talk about the case of spaceships with periods 31 over 240. In 2013, an analog of the switch engine was found, which eats blocks every 31 cells apart, every 240 steps. But could this be turned into a self-sufficient spaceship? A year later, an almost absurdly large, 934,000 by 290,000 cell pattern was constructed that did this by using streams of gliders and spaceships together with dynamically assembled glider guns to create appropriate blocks in front and remove them behind, along with all construction equipment that was used. And here's the picture of that, that object. By 2016, a pattern with 300 times less area had been constructed. And now, actually just a couple of months ago, a pattern with 1,300 times less area, just 11,974 by 45,755 cells, was constructed. Here it is. And it's a little hard to see. There are crisscrosses going back and forth here. But while this is still pretty huge, it's made of modular pieces that operate in an understandable way. No doubt there's a much smaller pattern that operates as a spaceship of the same speed, but computational irreducibility being what it is, we have no idea how large the pattern might be or how we might efficiently search for it. Glider guns. What can one engineer in the game of life? A crucial moment in the development of game of life engineering was the discovery that I mentioned before of the original glider gun in 1970. And what was particularly important about the glider gun is that it was a first example of something that could be thought of as a signal generator that one could imagine would allow one to implement electrical engineering style devices in the game of life. The original glider gun produces gliders every 30 steps, in a sense defining a clock speed of 1/30th for any circuit driven by it. Within a year after the original glider gun, 2 other slower glider guns had also been discovered, both working on similar principles, as one can kind of tell from their causal graphs. It wasn't until 1990 that any additional guns were found, And in the years since, a sequence of guns have been found with a rather wide range of distinct periods. Some of the guns found have very long periods. Here's an example of that. Periods 144, periods 256. But as part of the effort to do constructions in the 1990s, a gun was constructed that had overall period 210, but which interwove multiple glider streams to ultimately produce gliders every 14 steps, which is the maximum rate possible while avoiding interference of successive gliders. So over the years, a whole variety of different glider guns have been found. Some are in effect thoroughly controlled constructions. Others are more based on some complex process that is reined in to the point where it just produces a stream of gliders and nothing more. Here's an array of glider guns that have been produced over the years. An example of a somewhat surprising glider gun with the shortest true period known was found in 2024. The causal graph of this glider gun shows a mixture of irreducible kind of search-found parts together with a collection of well-known smaller modular parts. By the way, in 2013, it was actually found possible to extend the construction for oscillators of any period to a construction of guns for any period, or at least any period above 78. And those are some examples, but by these work by having streams of gliders, by having these circles of signals that every so often emit a glider. So in addition to having streams of gliders, it's also sometimes been found useful to have streams of other spaceships. Very early on, it was already known that one could create small spaceships by colliding gliders. Here's an example of that. But by the mid-1990s, it had also been found that direct spaceship guns could be made. And over the years, smaller and smaller optimized versions have been found. So the last of these from just a short while ago has a surprisingly simple structure being built from components that were already known 30 years ago and has a causal graph. Let's see if I can find this. Yes, has a causal graph that shows a very modular kind of construction. Let's talk about building from history. Talked about some of the history of how specific patterns in the game of life were found, but what about the overall flow of engineering progress? And in particular, when something new is found, how much does it build on what has been found before? In real-world engineering, things like patent citations potentially give one an indication of this. But in the game of life, one can approach the question much more systematically and directly, just asking what configurations of bits from older patterns are used in newer ones. As we talked about, given a pattern like this, one can pick out its modular parts. So here, rotated to canonical orientations. Then we can see if these parts correspond to any phase of previously known patterns, which in this case, they all do. So now for all structures in the database, we can ask what parts they involve. So here's a plot of the overall frequencies of those parts. So it's notable that the highest ranked part is a so-called eta that's often used in constructions, but occurs only quite infrequently in evolution from random initial conditions. It's also notable that for no particularly obvious reason, the frequency of the nth most common structure is roughly 1 over n. So when were the various structures that appear here first found? As this picture shows, most but not all were found very early in the history of the game of life. So time is going down the page here. In other words, most of the parts used in structures from any time in the history of the game of life come from very early in its history. Or in effect, structures typically go back to basics in the parts they use. So here's a more detailed picture showing the relative amount of use of each part in structures from each year. So there are definite fashions one can see here. with some structures coming into fashion for a while, and sometimes, but not always, right after they were first found, and then dropping out. One might imagine that perhaps smaller parts, i.e. ones with smaller areas, will be more popular than larger ones. But plotting areas of parts against their rank, we see that there are some large parts that are also quite common, and some small ones that are quite rare. So we've seen that many of the most popular parts overall are ones that were found early in the history of the game of life, but plenty of distinct modular parts were also found much later. So this shows the number of distinct new modular parts found across all patterns in successive years. So normalizing by the number of new patterns found in each year, we find sort of a gradual increase in the relative number of new modular parts, presumably reflecting the greater use of search in finding patterns or components of patterns. So things found by search don't have their own modular parts. But how important have these later found modular parts been? So this shows the rate at which modular parts found in a given year were subsequently used. And what we see once again is that the parts found early were overwhelmingly the ones that are subsequently used. A somewhat complementary way to look at this is to ask of all patterns found in a given year, how many are purely de novo, in the sense that they use no previously found modular parts. That's indicated in red here, and how many use previously found parts. So a cumulative version of this makes it clear that in the early years, most patterns are purely de novo, but later on, there's an increasing amount of reuse in blue of previously found parts, or in other words, in later years, the engineering history is increasingly important. It should be said, however, that if one wants the full story of what's being used, it's a bit more nuanced, because here we're always treating each modular part of each pattern as a separate entity, so that we consider any given pattern to depend only on base modular parts. But really, it could depend on another whole structure, itself built out of many modular parts. And in what we're doing here, we're not tracking that hierarchy of dependencies. Were we to do so, we would likely be able to see more complex technology stacks in the game of life. But instead, we're always going down to the primitives. So if we were dealing with electronics, it'd be like asking, what are the transistors and capacitors that are being used, rather than what's the caching architecture or how is the floating point unit set up? Okay, but in terms of base modular parts, a simple question to ask is how many get used in each pattern? So this shows the number of base modular parts in patterns found in a given year. So there are always a certain number of patterns that just consist of a single modular part. And as we talked about before, that was more common earlier in the history of the game of life. But now we also see that there have been an increasing number of patterns that use many modular parts, typically reflecting a higher degree of construction rather than search going on. By the way, for comparison, here are the total areas and numbers of black cells found in each year, showing increases early on, but more or less leveling off by the 1990s. So if we look across all patterns in the database, how many parts do they end up using? Here's the overall distribution. At least for a certain range of numbers of parts, this falls roughly exponentially, reflecting the idea that it's been exponentially less likely for people to come up with or find patterns that have progressively larger numbers of distinct modular parts. How has this changed over time? Well, this shows a cumulative plot of the relative frequencies with which different numbers of modular parts appear in patterns up to a given year, indicating that over time, the distribution of the number of modular parts has gotten progressively broader, or in other words, as we've seen in other ways before, more patterns make use of larger numbers of modular parts. So we've been looking at all the patterns that have been found, but we can also ask, say, just about oscillators. And then we can ask, for example, which oscillators with which periods contain which others, as in these pictures here. And looking at all known oscillators, we can see how common different oscillator primitives are in building up other oscillators. We can also ask in which year oscillator primitives at different ranks were found. Unlike in the case of all structures above, we can now see that some oscillator primitives that were found only quite recently appear at fairly high ranks, reflecting the fact that in this case, once a primitive has been found, it's often immediately useful in making oscillators that have multiples of its period. Oops. Okay, let's talk about lifetime hacking and diehards. So we can think of almost everything we've talked about so far as being aimed at creating structures like clocks and wires that are recognizably useful for building traditional machine-like engineering systems. But a different possible objective is to find patterns that have some feature we can recognize, whether with obvious immediate utility or not. And as one example of this, we can think about finding so-called die-hard patterns that live as long as possible before dying out. So the phenomenon of computational irreducibility tells us that even given a particular pattern, we can't in general know in advance how long it's going to take to die out, or if it ultimately dies out at all. So it's inevitable that the problem of finding ultimate die-hard patterns can be unboundedly difficult, just like analogous problems for other computational systems, such as finding so-called busy beavers in Turing machines. But in practice, one can use both search and construction techniques to find patterns that at least live a long time, even if not the very longest possible time. And as an example, here's a very simple pattern found by search that lives for 132 steps before dying out. So the puff at the end on the left is a reflection of how we're showing the trails. All the actual cells are zero by the point of that last frame. So searching nearly 10 to the 16 randomly chosen 16 by 16 patterns out of a total of about 10 to the 77 possible such patterns, the longest lifetime found is 1,413 steps, achieved with a rather random looking pattern. Here it is. But is this the best one can do? Well, no. Just consider a block and a spaceship end cells apart. It'll take 2 end steps for them to collide, and if the phases are right, annihilate each other. There they are, annihilating each other. So by picking the separation n to be large enough, we can make this configuration live as long as we want. But what if we limit the size of the initial pattern, say to 32 by 32? In 2022, the following pattern was constructed. And this pattern is carefully set up so that after 30,274 steps, everything lines up and it dies out. If we look at the sort of vertically foreshortened space-time diagram of this, there we go. We can kind of see what's happening here. And we can see this is the number of black cells as a function of number of steps. And we can see these different sort of steppings down associated with different annihilations that happen. And yes, the construction here clearly goes much further than search was able to reach. But can we go yet further? In 2023, a 116 by 86 pattern was constructed. Here it is. That was proved, and it was proved that this eventually dies out, but only after the absurdly large number of 17 sort of 3 arrows, 3 steps, probably much larger than the number of eames on the Rouliad, and given by, well, that's a Wolfram language expression for it, or that's after doing the inner part of it after explicitly or more explicitly evaluating the inner part. So this is an absurdly large number. It's the result of not tetration, pentation, but some kind of hexation of nested powering kinds of operations. So yes, you can make structures that live for a very, very long time by construction. Well, let's compare with adaptive evolution. There's some definite rough ways in which technology development parallels biological evolution. Both involve the concept of trying out possibilities and building on ones that work. But technology development has always ultimately been driven by human effort, whereas biological evolution is, in a sense, a blind process based on the natural selection of random mutations. So, what happens if we try to apply something like biological evolution to the game of life? So as an example, let's look at the adaptive evolution that's trying to maximize finite lifetime based on making a sequence of random point mutations with an initially random 16 by 16 pattern. Most of those mutations don't give patterns with larger finite lifetimes, but occasionally there's a breakthrough and the lifetime achieved so far jumps up. So the actual behaviors corresponding to the breakthroughs in this case look like this. And uh, here are some other outcomes from adaptive evolution, showing the number of steps that they live for. So in almost all cases, a limited number of steps of adaptive evolution that does succeed in generating patterns with fairly long finite lifetimes. But the behavior we see typically shows no sort of readily understandable mechanisms and no obviously separable modular parts. And instead, just like in recent studies I've done of biological evolution and machine learning, what we get are basically lumps of irreducible computation that just happen to show what we're looking for here, long lifetimes. Invented or discovered, made for a purpose at all. Let's say we're presented with an array of cells that's an initial condition for the game of life. Can we tell where it came from? Is it just arbitrary or random? Or was it set up for a purpose? And if it was set up for a purpose, was it invented and constructed for that purpose? Or was it just discovered, say, by search to fulfill that purpose? Whether one's dealing with archaeology, evolutionary biology, forensic science, the identification of alien intelligence, or for that matter, theology, the question of whether something was set up for a purpose is a philosophically fraught one. Any behavior one sees can potentially one can potentially explain either in terms of the mechanism that produces it or in terms of what it achieves. Things get a little clearer if we have a particular language for describing both mechanisms and purposes. Then we can ask questions like, is the behavior we care about more succinctly described in terms of its mechanism or its purpose? So, for example, it behaves as a period 15 glider gun might be an adequate purpose-oriented description that's much shorter than a mechanism-oriented description in terms of arrangements of cells. But what is the appropriate lexicon of purposes for the game of life? In effect, that's a core question for game of life engineering, because what engineering and technology in general is ultimately about is taking whatever raw material is available, whether from the physical world or from the game of life, and then somehow fashioning it into something that aligns with human purposes. But then we're back to what counts as a valid human purpose. How deeply does the purpose have to connect into everything we do? Is it, for example, enough for something to look nice? Or is that not utilitarian enough? There aren't absolute answers to these questions, and indeed the answers can change over time as new uses for things are discovered or invented. But for the game of life, we can start with some of the purposes we've discussed here, like be an oscillator of a certain period, reflect gliders, generate the primes, or even just die after as long as possible. Let's say we just start enumerating possible initial patterns, either randomly or exhaustively. How often will we come across patterns that achieve one of these purposes? And will it achieve that purpose, or will it also do extra stuff that seems irrelevant? As an example, consider enumerating all 3 by 3 patterns of cells. There are altogether 2 to the 9, 512 such patterns, or just 102 after reducing by symmetries. Of these, 79 evolved to purely static patterns, while 17 evolved to patterns of period 2. But only one in 2 phases is immediately a period 2, and so might reasonably be interpreted immediately as having been created for the purpose of being period 2. Other patterns can take a while to become period 2, but then at least give pure period 2 objects. And for example, this is the smallest one that can be interpreted as being the Right. This is the smallest one that can be interpreted as the smallest example, as being the smallest precursor and taking the least time to produce the period two object that it generates. Let's see. Yes, that generates a period two objects. This is the smallest one, that smallest initial condition that generates period two objects, and uh, so there are other cases that sort of get to the same place, but seem to wander around doing so, and therefore don't seem to be as convincing as having been created for the purpose of making a period two oscillator. Then there are much more egregious cases, uh, like this one, which after 173 steps gives this pattern, um, which includes period two oscillators, but only after going through all sorts of complicated intermediate behavior. That definitely doesn't make it look like it's going straight to its purpose, unless perhaps its purpose is to produce that final pattern from the smallest possible initial precursors, and so on. But okay, let's imagine we have a pattern that goes straight to some recognizable purpose, like being an oscillator of a certain period. The next question is, was that pattern explicitly constructed with an understanding of how it would achieve its purpose, or was it instead blindly found by some kind of search? So as an example, let's look at some period 9 oscillators. So one like this seems like it must have been constructed out of existing parts, while one like this seems like it could only have plausibly been found by a search. Space-time views don't tell us much in these particular cases, but causal graphs are much more revealing. They show that in the first case, there are lots of factored modular parts, while in the second case, there's basically just one irreducible blob with no obvious separable parts. And we can view this as an immediate signal for sort of how human each pattern is. In a sense, it's a reflection of the computational boundedness of our minds. When there are factored modular parts that interact fairly rarely and each behave in a fairly simple way, it's realistic for us to just get our minds around what's going on. But when there's just an irreducible blob of activity, we'd have to compute too much and keep too much in mind at once for us to be able to really understand what's going on and, for example, produce a human level narrative explanation of it. If we find a pattern by search, however, we don't really have to understand it. It's just something we computationally discover out there in the computational universe that happens to do what we want. And indeed, as in the example right here, it often does what it does in a quite minimal, if incomprehensible way. Something that's found by human effort is much less likely to be minimal. In effect, it's at least somewhat optimized for comprehensibility rather than for minimality or ease of being found by search. And indeed, it will often be far too big, for example, in terms of number of cells, for any pure exhaustive or random search to plausibly find it, even though the human level narrative for it might be quite short. So here are the causal graphs from all the period 9 oscillators from before. Some we can see can readily be broken down into multiple rarely interacting distinct components. Others can't be decomposed in this kind of way. In a first approximation, the decomposable ones seem to be precisely those that were somehow constructed by human effort, while the non-decomposable ones seem to be those that were discovered by searchers. Typically, the way the constructions are done is to start with some collection of known parts, then by trial and error, sometimes computer assisted, see how these can be fit together to get something that does what one wants. Searchers, on the other hand, typically operate on raw configurations of cells, blindly going through a large number of possible configurations, at every stage automatically testing whether one's got something that does what one wants. And in the end, these definite strategies reveal themselves in the character of the final patterns they produce and in the causal graphs that represent these patterns and their behavior. So let's talk about the general principles of engineering strategy from the game of life. So In engineering, as it's traditionally been practiced, the main emphasis tends to be on figuring out plans uh, and then constructing things based on those plans. Typically, one starts from components one has, then tries to figure out how to combine them to incrementally build up what one wants. But as we talked about, there's also a way of developing technology in the game of life. But as we've talked about at length, it's not the only way. Another way is just to search for a whole piece of technology one wants. Traditional intuition might make one assume that this would be hopeless. But the repeated lesson of my discoveries about simple programs, as well as what's been done with the game of life, is that actually it's often not hopeless at all, and instead it's very powerful. Yes, what you get is not likely to be readily understandable, but it is likely to be minimal and potentially quite optimal for whatever it is that it does. I've often talked about this approach as mining from the computational universe. And over the course of many years, I've had success with it in all sorts of disparate areas. And now here we've seen it in the game of life, a particularly clean example where search is used alongside construction in developing technology. It's a feature of things produced by construction that they're born understandable. In effect, they're computationally reducible enough that we can fit them into our finite minds and understand them. But things found by search don't have this feature. And most of the time, the behavior they'll show will be full of computational irreducibility. In both biological evolution and machine learning, my own recent investigations suggest that most of what we're seeing are lumps of irreducible computation found at random that just happen to achieve the necessary objectives. This hasn't been something familiar in traditional engineering, but it's something tremendously powerful. And from the examples we've seen here in the game of life, it's clear that it can often achieve things that seem completely inaccessible by traditional methods based on explicit construction. At first, we might assume that irreducible computation is too unruly and unpredictable to be useful in achieving understandable objectives. But if we find just the right piece of irreducible computation, then it'll achieve the objective we want, often in a very minimal way. And the point is that the computational universe is in a sense big enough that we'll usually be able to find that right piece of irreducible computation. One thing we see in game of life engineering is something that's in a sense a compromise between irreducible computation and predictable construction. The basic idea is to take something that's computationally irreducible and to put it in a cage that constrains it to do what one wants. The computational irreducibility is in a sense the spark in the system. The cage provides the control we need to harness that spark in a way that meets our objectives. So let's look at some examples. As our spark, we'll use the R pentomino that we talked about at the very beginning. On its own, this generates all sorts of complex behavior, and for the most part doesn't align with typical objectives we might define. Though as sort of a sideshow, it does happen to generate gliders. But the idea is to put constraints on the R pentomino that make it useful. So let me show you a case here that here's a case where we've tried to build a road for the R pentomino to go down. So looking at this every 18 steps, we see that at least for a while, the R pentomino has indeed moved down the road, but it's also generated something of an explosion. And eventually this explosion catches up and the R pentomino is destroyed. So can we maintain enough control to let the R pentomino survive? The answer is yes. And here, for example, is a period 12 oscillator sort of powered by an R pentomino at its center. So without the R pentomino, the structure we've set up just cycles with period 6. But when we insert the R pentomino, this structure keeps it under control so that the only effect it ultimately has is to double the period to 12. So here's a more dramatic example. Start with a static configuration of 4 so-called ethers. Now insert 2 R pentominos. They'll start doing their thing, generating what seems like quite random behavior, but the cage defined by the ethers limits what can happen. In the end, what emerges is an oscillator that has period 129. So what else can one make our pentominoes do? Well, with appropriate harnesses, they can, for example, be used to power oscillators with many different periods. Be an oscillator of a certain period is, in a sense, a simple objective. What about more complex objectives? Of course, any pattern of cells in the game of life will do something, but the question is whether that something aligns with technological objectives we have. Generically, things in the game of life will behave in computationally irreducible ways, and it's this very fact that gives such richness to what can be done with the game of life. But can the computational irreducibility be controlled and harnessed for technological purposes? In a sense, this is the core challenge of engineering in both the game of life and in the real world. It's also rather directly the challenge we face in making use of the computational power of AI, but still adequately aligning it with human objectives. As we look at the arc of technological development in the game of life, we see over the course of half a century all sorts of different advances being made. But will there be an end to this? Will we eventually run out of inventions and discoveries? The underlying presence of computational irreducibility makes it clear that we will not. The only thing that might happen, that might end, is the set of objectives we're trying to meet. We now know how to make oscillators of any period. And unless we insist on, for example, finding the smallest oscillator of a given period, we can consider the problem of finding oscillators solved with nothing more to discover. In the real world, nature and the evolution of the universe inevitably confront us with new issues which lead to new objectives. In the game of life, as in any other abstract area like mathematics, the issue of defining new objectives is up to us. Computational irreducibility leads to infinite diversity and richness of what's possible. The issue for us is to figure out what direction we want to go, and the story of engineering and technology in the game of life gives us, in effect, a simple model for the issues we confront in other areas of technology like AI. Well, I also included some personal backstory, so let me tell you a little bit of that and a little bit of how it dovetails with the general history of game of life. I'm not sure if I made the right decision back in 1981. I had come up with a very simple class of systems and was doing computer experiments on them and was starting to get some interesting results. And when I mentioned what I was doing to a group of then young computer scientists, they said, "Oh, those things you're studying are called cellular automata." Well, actually, the cellular automata they were talking about were 2D systems while mine were 1D. And though that might seem like a technical difference, it has a big effect on one's impression of what's going on, because in 1D, one can readily see space-time histories that give an immediate sense of the whole behavior of the system, while in 2D, one basically can't. I wondered what to call my models. I toyed with the term polymones as a modernized nod to Leibniz's monads. But in the end, I decided I should stick with a simpler connection to history and just call my models, like their 2D analogs, cellular automata. In many ways, I'm happy with that decision, though one of its downsides has been a certain amount of conceptual confusion, more than anything centered around the game of life. People often know that the game of life is an example of a cellular automaton, and they also know that within the game of life, lots of structures like gliders and glider guns can be set up to do particular things. Meanwhile, they hear about my discoveries about the generation of complexity in cellular automata like Rule 30, and somehow they conflate these things, leading to all too many books that show pictures of simple gliders in the game of life and say alongside them, "Look at all this complexity." Well, at some level, it's a confusion between science and engineering. My efforts around cellular automata have centered on empirical science questions, like what does this cellular automaton do if you run it? But as I've talked about at length here, most of what's been done with the game of life has centered instead on questions of engineering, like what recognizable or useful structures can you build in the system? It's a different objective with different results. And in particular, by asking to engineer understandable technology, one specifically eschewing the phenomenon of computational irreducibility and the whole story of the emergence of complexity that's been so central to my own scientific work on cellular automata and so much else. Many times over the years, people would show me things they've been able to build in the game of life, and I really wouldn't know what to make of them. Yes, they seemed like impressive hacks, but what was the big picture? Was this just fun, or was there some broader intellectual point? Well, finally, not long ago, I realized this is not a story of science. It's a story of the arc of engineering, or what one can call meta-engineering. And back in 2018, in connection with the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Game of Life, I decided to see what I could figure out about this. But I wasn't satisfied with how far I got, and other priorities interceded. So beyond one small comment that ended up in a 2020 New York Times article, I didn't write anything about what I'd done. And the project languished. Until now, when somehow my long-time interest in alien engineering, combined with my recent results about biological evolution, coalesced into a feeling that it was time to finally figure out what one could learn from all that effort that's been put into the game of life. In a sense, this brings closure to a very long-running story for me. The first time I heard about the game of life was in 1973. I was an early teenager then, and I'd just gotten access to a computer. By today's standards, the computer in Elliott 903C was a primitive one, size of a desk, programmed with paper tape, with only 24 kilobytes of memory. So I was interested in using it for things like writing a simulator for the physics of idealized gas molecules. But other kids who had access to the computer were instead more interested, much as many kids might be today, in writing games. Someone wrote a Hunt the Wumpus game, and someone else wrote a program for the game of life. The configurations of cells at each generation were printed out on a teleprinter. And for some reason, people were particularly taken, I remember, with the Cheshire Cat configuration, in which all that was left at the end, as in Alice in Wonderland, was a smile, which eventually disappears. At the time, I absolutely didn't see the point of any of this. I was interested in science, not games, and the game of life pretty much lost me at the word game. So for a number of years, I didn't have any further contact with the game of life. But then I met Bill Gosper, who I later learned had in 1970 discovered the glider gun in the game of life. I met Gosper first online. Yes, even in 1978, that was a thing, at least if you used the MIT MC computer through the ARPANET. Then in person, I met Bill in 1979. And in 1980, I actually visited him at Xerox PARC, where he described himself as part of the entertainment division and gave me sort of strange-looking math formulas printed out on sort of not yet out of the lab color laser printer, but also showed me a bitmap display complete with a GUI with lots of pixels dancing around that he enthusiastically explained was showing the game of life. Knowing what I know now, I would have been excited by what I saw, but at the time, it didn't really register. Still, in 1981, having started my big investigation of 1D cellular automata and having made the connection to the 2D case of the game of life, I started wondering whether there was something scientifically useful that I could glean from all the effort I knew, particularly from Gosper, had been put into life. Well, it didn't help that almost none of the output of that effort had been published. And in those days before the web, personal contact was pretty much the only way to get unpublished material. One of my larger finds was from a friend of mine from Oxford who passed on lab notebook pages he'd got from someone who was enumerating outcomes from different game of life initial configurations. And from material like this, as well as my own simulations, I came up with some tentative scientific conclusions, which I summarized in 1982 in a paragraph in my first big paper about cellular automata. But then at the beginning of 1983, as part of my continuing effort to do science on cellular automata, I made a discovery. Among all cellular automata, there seem to be four basic classes of behavior, with class 4 being characterized by the presence of localized structures, sometimes periodic, sometimes moving. That's a printout with my old login, Swolf, for me to know that that was a printout for me that came out on the printer. Well, I immediately recognized the analogy to the game of life and to oscillators and gliders there. And indeed, this analogy was part of what tipped me off to thinking about the ubiquitous computational capabilities of cellular automata and to the phenomenon of computational irreducibility. Meanwhile, in March 1983, I co-organized what was effectively the first ever conference on cellular automata, held at Los Alamos, and one of the people I invited was Gosper. he announced his hash life algorithm, which was crucial to future life research there, and came bearing gifts, printouts for me of Game of Life that I annotated and still have in my archives. I asked Gosper to do some more scientific experiments for me, for example, starting from a region of randomness, then seeing what happened. But Gosper wasn't really interested in what I saw as being science. He wanted to do engineering and make constructions like uh, this one that he gave me showing two glider guns exchanging streams of gliders. Why would one care? I wondered. I'd mostly studied 1D cellular automata, where I discovered a lot by systematically looking at their behavior laid out in space-time. But in early 1984, I resolved to also systematically check out 2D cellular automata, and mostly the resounding conclusion was that their basic behavior was very similar to 1D. Out of all the rules we studied, the Game of Life didn't particularly stand out, but mostly to provide a familiar comparison point, I included pictures of it in the paper that we wrote. And we also went to the trouble of making a 3D space-time picture of the Game of Life on a Cray supercomputer, though it was too small to show anything terribly interesting. It had been a column in Scientific American in 1970 that had first propelled the Game of Life to public prominence, that had also launched the first great life engineering challenge of finding a glider gun. And in both 1984 and 1985, a successor to that very same column ran stories about my one-dimensional cellular automata. And in 1985, in collaboration with Scientific American, I thought it'd be fun and interesting to reprise the 1970 glider gun challenge, but now for 1D class 4 cellular automata. Well, many people participated, and my main conclusion was that yes, it seemed like one could do the same kind of engineering in typical 1D class 4 cellular automata as one could in the Game of Life. But this was all several years before the web and the kind of online community that's driven so much of Game of Life engineering in modern times wasn't yet able to form. Meanwhile, by the next year, I was starting the development of Mathematica and what's now Wolfram language, and for a few years, I didn't have much time to think about cellular automata. But in 1987, when Gosper got involved in making pre-release demos of Mathematica, he once again excitedly told me about his discoveries in the Game of Life and gave me pictures like this. Well, it was in 1992 that the Game of Life once again appeared in my life. I'd recently embarked on what would become the 10-year project of writing my book, A New Kind of Science. I was working on one of the rather few, I already have this figured out, sections in the book. And I wanted to compare class 4 behavior in 1D and 2D. How was I to display the Game of Life, especially in a static book? Equipped with what's now the Wolfram language, it was easy to come up with visualizations looking out into a space-time slice with more distant cells kind of in a fog, as well as down into a fog of successive states. And yes, it was immediately striking how similar the space-time slice looked to my picture of sort of 1D class 4 cellular automata. And when I wrote a note for the end of the book about life, the correspondence became even more obvious. I'd always seen the glider gun as a movie, but in a space-time slice, it kind of made much more sense and looked kind of incredibly similar to analogous structures in 1D class 4 cellular automata. So in A New Kind of Science, I put a lot of effort into historical notes. And as part of such a note on history of cellular automata, I had a paragraph about the Game of Life. I first met John Conway in September 1983 at a conference in the south of France. As I would tell his biographer many years later, my relationship with Conway was complicated from the start. We were both drawn to systems defined by very simple rules, but what we found interesting about them was very different. I wanted to understand the big picture and to explore sort of science-oriented questions and what I would now call ruleology. Conway, on the other hand, was interested in specific, often whimsically presented results and in questions that could be couched as mathematical theorems. In my conversations with Conway, the Game of Life would sometimes come up but Conway never seemed too interested in talking about it. In 2001, though, when I was writing my note about the history of 2D cellular automata, I spent several hours specifically asking Conway about the game of life and its history. At first, Conway told me the standard origin story that life had arisen as a kind of game. A bit later, he'd said he'd at the time just been hired as a logic professor and had wanted to use life as a simple way to enumerate the recursive functions. In the end, it was hard to disentangle true recollections from false or elaborated ones, and notably when asked directly about the origin of the specific rules of life, he was evasive. Of course, none of that should detract from Conway's achievement in the concept of the game of life and the definition of the kind of hacker-like culture around it, the fruits of which have now allowed me to do what I've talked about here. So for many years after the publication of A New Kind of Science in 2002, I didn't actively engage with the game of life, though I would hear about it from life enthusiasts with some frequency, but none as much as Gosper, from whom I was the recipient of hundreds of messages about life. So a typical example from 2017 concerning this object here and saying, describing this as unlimited question mark novelty from just two LWSS back rakes. I think LWSS is lightweight spaceship back rakes. Novelty is mediated by the sporadic glider gas, which forms very sparse beams, sporadic debris forming sparse lines, and is hidden in sporadic defects in the denser beams and lines. So and then Gosper goes on, at this scale, showing this picture, each screen pixel represents 262,144 by 262,144 life cells. Thus, very sparse lines, e.g. density, 10 to the minus 5, appear solid while being very nearly transparent to gliders. After 3.4 G, that's billions, sparse new glider beams are still fading up. The beams repeatedly strafe the X and Y stalagmites, the X and Y axis stalagmites. I suspect this will very eventually lead to a positive density of switch engines and thus quadratic population growth. And he goes on and ends up saying, finally, around 4.2 G, 4.2 billion steps, and eta 1 fishhook appears, I guess. Depending on background novelty radiation, there ought to be one of these every few billion, all lying in a line through the origin, etc., etc. So Gosper goes on with much help from Tom R., that's Tom Rokicki, I think. I slogged to 18G, 18 billion steps, with 0 new non-movers in the fourth quadrant, causing me to propose a mechanism that precluded future new ones. But then Andrew Trevorrow fired up his Big Mac, TM, ran 60G and found these three new non-movers. They are respectively a mirror image of the first eta and two blinkers in phase, but not aligned with the origin, i.e. all four are oneers, or at least will rely on different trash trails. I'm still waiting for one of these to sprout switch engines and begin quadratic growth. Anyway, it goes on, but here's a puzzle. Doesn't the gas of sparse gliders actually glide packets in the diagonal strips athwart the first quadrant already reveal small coefficient quadratic growth, which will eventually dominate? The area of the strips is increasing quadratically. Their density appears to be at least holding, but possibly only along one axis. I don't see where quadratically many gliders could arise. They're being manufactured at a roughly fixed rate. Imagine the above picture in the distant future. Where is the amplification that will keep those strips full? Signed, Bill. Well, does it just happen to come out that way, or was it something made to be that way? It was a big shock to my intuition at the beginning of the 1980s when I began to see sort of all the richness in that even very simple programs can produce. And it made me start to wonder about all our technological and other achievements, with our goals and intentions, were we producing things that were somehow different from what even simple programs could do anyway? How would we be able to tell that that interstellar radio signal was the product of some sophisticated civilization or just something that happened naturally? My principle of computational equivalence implied that at an ultimate level, there really wouldn't be a way to tell. But I kept on wondering whether there might be at least some signature of purposes like ours that we could detect. At first, it was extraterrestrial intelligence and animal intelligence, later also artificial intelligence, but the question kept on coming back. What distinguishes what's engineered from what just scientifically happens? And yes, there's a sort of theological question in there too. I'd wondered for a while about using the Game of Life as a testing ground for this, and as the 50th anniversary of the Game of Life approached in 2018, I took this as a cue to explore it. Over the years, I had accumulated a paper file, perhaps 6 inches thick, about the Game of Life, a few samples from which I've already showed here. But looking around the web, I was impressed at how much well-organized material there now was about the Game of Life. I started to try to analyze it, imagining that I might see something like an analog of Moore's law. Meanwhile, over the preceding decade, I'd written a lot about the history of science, and I thought that as part of my contribution to the 50th anniversary of the Game of Life, I should try to write about its history. What were the stories of all those people whose names were attached to discoveries in life? A research assistant of mine began to track them all down and interview them. It turned out to be a very disparate group, many of whom knew little about each other, though they often, but not always, had in common graduate level education in math. And in any case, it became clear that writing a coherent history was going to be a huge undertaking. In addition, the first few ways I tried to discern trends in data about the Game of Life didn't yield much. And soon the 50th anniversary had passed, and I got busy with other things. But the project of studying the meta-engineering of the Game of Life stayed on my to-do list, and a couple of students at our Waltham Summer School also worked on it. Then in 2022, a nice book on the Game of Life came out by Nathaniel Johnston and Dave Green, the latter of whom had actually been at our summer school back in 2011. Had my project been reduced to just reading this book, I wondered. I soon realized that it hadn't, and there were now all kinds of questions on which I imagined a study of the Game of Life could shed light. Not only questions about the signature of purpose, but also questions about novelty and creativity, and about the arc and rhythm of innovation. Then, in 2024, came the surprises of my work on biological evolution and on machine learning, and I found myself again wondering about how things work when there's intentional engineering. And so I finally decided to do my long-planned study of the Game of Life. There's much, much more that could be done, but I think what I've done and talked about here provides an indication of some of the directions one can go and some of what there is to discover and what's effectively the new field of computational meta-engineering. Okay, and that's what I wrote. So let's see, I would be happy to somewhat briefly answer a few questions about this. So if people have those, I might try to do that, although I do have to disappear soon. Elsie asks, what does the existence and prevalence of heuristics in innovation and technological advancements suggest with respect to reducibility and pockets thereof in terms of efficiency and so on? Well, that's an interesting question. What is a heuristic? Do AIs find them, for example? I think one of the lessons from Game of Life and from the importance of search is that search tends to blow away heuristics. In other words, heuristics can be thought of as a more efficient kind of a way to guide search more efficiently. But so far, not so many. I mean, it's an interesting question to what extent heuristics can be successful at guiding search in Game of Life. It's very related to questions like, can heuristics be useful in finding the path to go in proving theorems or finding theorems that might be interesting in metamathematical space? I'm somewhat pessimistic about, for example, LLMs, or for that matter, humans, being able to sort of engage with that question. I kind of think that the kind of the patterns of bits are sort of too austere to be able to ramp up our kind of human level thinking to deal with that. If we had maybe if there were kind of names for things and it reminded us that if we had an eater interacting with a carnivore or something, that the other things we know in sort of general knowledge about eaters and carnivores might give us suggestions. But I don't think that those things, the whimsical names, for example, given to things in the game of life, have very little to do with have only to do with things like visual appearance. And I don't think we can sort of engage those heuristics in an example like this. Okay, a couple more questions. Ontological. Um, the resulting structures, they say, can only arise from their probability, which always precedes their actualization. Just see if I can move this around. Oh, how strange, I cannot. Let's see. My question is, how does the probability pull out what is sought from the standing reserve, which serves as a reservoir for the constituents? I'm afraid I don't entirely understand that question. Yeah, I think if you ask the question, sort of what happens probabilistically in the game of life, the game of life and many class 4 cellular automata are good examples of bad examples of probabilistic thinking. In other words, if you just sort of fuzz things out and you say, what's the average number of cells in this place or that place, you completely lose the point. The kinds of structures and behaviors you get are completely blown up by making those probabilistic assumptions. In kind of physics, one talks about things like mean field theory, where one says one tries to figure out what will happen based on the averages of things happening before. And if you do that to a class 4 cellular automaton, it doesn't do what class 4 cellular automata do. Class 4 cellular automata are a quintessential example where probabilistic arguments and so on don't work. Now, do they work in sort of meta engineering space, in the space of possible configurations? I don't think so. I think, again, sort of when irreducibility is up close, when computational irreducibility is up close, probabilistic things don't work. Probabilistic ideas don't work very well. In fact, in a sense, the very idea that you can treat things probabilistically or statistically is sort of a denial of computational irreducibility. It's a form of computational reducibility. So when computational irreducibility is kind of flashing, out in front of your face, the reducibility of probabilistic approaches is not going to work well. Let's see, from Michael. Builder of human plus digital learning ecosystems. What can the game of life tell us about complex systems of human governance and how to remake those for the age of AI? Oh, well, that's a complicated question. I think we haven't seen the game of life kind of make a society. We have seen how you need sort of sparks of unpredictable irreducibility to make interesting things happen with sort of a cage to make them something that is somehow predictable. I think in a sense what we're seeing there is that irreducibility, computational irreducibility, is something that's very related to kind of unexpected innovation. And the sort of caging of that is what you do if you want innovation in a track. You want to get another oscillator period, another this, that, or the other. But if you want innovation that hasn't even got words to describe it, you really have to deal with raw computational irreducibility, not something kind of in that cage. Now, when it comes to kind of the operation of human society, one of the things that we rely on is the sort of somewhat predictability of what's going to happen. We kind of think, most people think, many people think at least, that the purely predictable human society is not one that is making use of our human capabilities in the best way. I mean, if all of life consisted as it does for some people, and some people choose this, of a kind of very rote kind of thing where at every minute of every day you're doing this particular thing that might be some kind of ritual activity, or at least to other people, it looks like sort of a ritual activity. That seems to most people that that level of predictability is undesirable. Um, Perhaps to others, it's not. I mean, for myself, for example, I lead in many ways a quite predictable life. I get up at the same time every day. I eat the same thing for breakfast every day, and so on, leaving me to think about lots of very different intellectual things. And I find that a useful kind of approach. To other people, it's like more things are made predictable, including maybe even the things one thinks about are made predictable. But it seems like one has, if one wants sort of change and progress, occasionally one has to have the unpredictable, the sort of the spark of computational irreducibility show up. And we certainly see that kind of phenomenon in Game of Life. We see, but we see also that the spark in something like Game of Life, Class 4 cellular automaton, we see that the spark of creativity can die out. The long time behavior, if you do not add more sort of computational irreducibility, can become entirely repetitive and predictable. So I don't know what analogies that has for what we see in sort of human and AI governance. It's an interesting question. One should think more about that. Um, but that's a few thoughts right now. Uh, let's see. Brady comments, what will be the future of engineering in the game of life? Will we run out of objectives? That's a good question. I mean, that's that's really where the creativity comes in. And also, as we think about AI, that's where the creativity comes in. We can make an AI that optimizes well, recognize these kinds of images, write this kind of text, but the thing that is sort of the thing left to us humans is to define out of all the possible kind of computational directions that AI could go in, which are the ones that seem to us worth going in. And I think it's a good point that the game of life is very much a metaphor for that issue, that we will run out of engineering to do in the game of life if we don't invent new kinds of things to engineer. We will have found the smallest oscillator of all particular periods. We will have found this particular way of making a Turing machine. But there is sort of an infinite diversity of possibilities as there is in engineering in the physical universe. And it's the question is, where do we want to go? What do we want to do? Is that thing that we see in the game of life just a bunch of random computationally irreducible behavior? Or is it something where we can say, aha, that's doing a thing that's super useful for my pursuit of squifflery or something, where where squifflery is something that hasn't yet been invented, but once invented is something where people say, "Hey, that's a really cool thing. I want to do that too," and then that kind of becomes an engineering objective. Good name, actually, squifflery. I just came up with that. Let's see. Maybe last question for today. How does the general-purposeness of structures, LC asks, affect this analysis when considering wide-use technologies and such versus just sort of self-perpetuation in the case of cellular automata? So that's an interesting question. How general purpose are the structures one makes? And uh, our greatest example of general purposeness is universal computers, that we can just have a fixed piece of hardware and do so many different things just by using software. One day, those things will be possible at a molecular scale, I suspect, when we'll have kind of the universal molecules that can do lots of different things. In a sense, life has made use of that idea in proteins in saying, well, you just have to make strings of amino acids, and then you can make all these different shapes and all these different purposes. And the immune system uses that in a particular way. But in general, life uses that to create the things that make up us. So I think it's a reasonable question. When do we get kind of general purpose structures that can be harnessed in a way where where most of the structure just operates the same, but some particular aspect of it is effectively programmed to do something? Is that a thing that we can see? That hasn't been a thing that's been seen that's been really found that will be a good engineering objective for game of life. I mean, there have been constructions of things like Turing machines, but they're immensely complicated. Having something that is more like kind of life as we know it in biology, where there is, the analog of amino acids or something, where there's comparatively small structures that can be assembled to do all kinds of different things, would be an interesting objective for game of life. And it's an interesting question to what extent in other systems, other kinds of cellular automata and other kinds of simple computational systems, to what extent you can get kind of general purpose components. I mean, at some level, the underlying system with its underlying pattern of bits is a general purpose set of components, but that's operating at the machine code level. To what extent can we have kind of higher level general purpose pieces in the system? I mean, in a sense, the story of much of my life has been constructing the right kinds of primitives in Wolfram language as a way to represent the computational kinds of things that we humans want to do. That's at a very high level of kind of representation. The question would be sort of at different levels of representation, to what extent can we have general purpose components that we put together versus sort of doing everything in machine code? What's the high level language of the game of life? That would be a good question to ask. To what extent can a high level language be produced? And to some extent, some of the things that have been done with styles of construction are a bit like that. But there's certainly more one can ask about how one can do that. And in the end, constructing a high level language, as I've done for so many years with Wolfram language, is as much about the users, the humans, as it is about the underlying stuff that makes in which the language is executed. I mean, the how the Wolfram language is built depends on how humans are expected to use it. And for example, over the 40 years or so that I've been working on it, the kinds of things that people readily know about have changed. And so the kinds of constructs that I can use in the language have changed, because people wouldn't have understood them 40 years ago, but now they're sort of part of the standard corpus of what people understand. And so we can leverage that in building this particular language. So as I say, sort of the construction of a high-level language for anything, including game of life, would be something that is sort of a question of who are the users going to be. I mean, if it turned out that we could get dogs or cockatoos or whatever else to start making structures in the game of life, their high-level language for making structures more efficiently might or might not be the same as the ones that we use in doing this kind of thing. And if we start being able to have a sort of I suppose an exercise there would be a kind of text to engineered action for the game of life kind of system in AI, where you could sort of tell the AI, just make this thing that will make period 3, will compute all the primes of the form 4m plus 1 or something like this, and have it do that using sort of high level constructs. That would be something where we're making use of sort of some high level intermediate language above the machine code of game of life, which I don't think something like an LLM will have any easy time dealing with, except in toy examples. Having some intermediate language which is more humanized, more LLMified, and which the LLM would be capable of dealing with, and doing something like doing a text to life structure type transformation. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining me here. And you can find the things I was talking about in the post that I made now, oh gosh, about a month ago, about this. And you can also find, if you look at the post, every picture in the post, you can click on it. You get Wolfram language code. You can run it in any Wolfram language notebook or anything that runs Wolfram language, and you can play with it yourself. And there are so many things to do with this project. It's kind of a seed for an infinite number of possible sort of projects that can be done by people who are interested as hobbyists, or by students, or by other kinds of people. That's true of a lot of posts I make. They are as much as anything seeds. I try to pick some of the most obvious low-hanging fruit, but there's much left for many years of interesting work, I hope, that people can find fun to pursue. So thanks very much, and bye for now.